How do we get people to care?
We're all interested in kind of the similar thing. How do we influence other people's behavior?
What about people that don't believe you?
Never put things in an us versus them mentality. It's going to separate groups further.
Do you need tools to do that?
Your metaphors and examples that you use can have some really strong impacts.
Whenever you're trying to deliver something more informational, but also have that story element, I don't think I found that balance yet.
All right, Charlie, story every time.
But that's still one person, not people.
Let's scale it out to a population level because that's what we need. We need like the steering of the ship.
I feel like that was the answer of somebody who is very data driven.
That could be a very fair way to say it. And I am very, very data driven.
Today, we're looking at human behavior and climate change. It's a very interesting, but also kind of worrying combination. If you ever have wondered how to reach people who ignore climate change exists or just simply not care at all, this might be the episode for you. But before we get to that, we'll have to start to understand, well, why we do the things that we do in the first place. So in this episode, we sit down with Ryan O'Donnell, a behavioral scientist and filmmaker. Ryan has years of experience into the field of applied behavior analysis, but also understands the nuances of content creation. Now, not gonna lie, this is a beefy episode, but there's so many nuggets in this conversation, especially if you are on a very similar path to what we are. We'll explore how creators can create content that connects instead of polarize and push people away, and maybe even induce some behavioral changes in the process. But let's start with, why is it so difficult to get people to watch our content in the first place?
In short, behavior analysis is, I kind of describe it as a way to view the world, what's influencing people, and how do we understand either our own behavior or some professions and fields, like how do we influence other people's behavior? So whether, it's economics or other forms of psychology, like we're all interested in kind of the similar thing. I've decided to pick up a camera. I realized it was so difficult to edit something, put something together. But there's also these weird intersections too. Like, how do you get somebody to watch something without ever hearing or seeing them? That kind of interested me. And I think that's what filmmakers are really trying to do at the end of the day, is they're trying to influence people, which is what behavior analysis tries to do. And they're doing it through, this medium where you don't have direct access to the person. I was used to working directly with somebody, being able to take data and look at it. With this, you have to create something that essentially is almost perfect by the time you launch it, and in its ability to influence and kind of move people emotionally or whatnot. So behavior analysis is really the worldview. We're looking at how do we help somebody achieve goals through science. And what did I miss there? Did I miss things? Is anything unclear?
One thing that I think stood out from what you said is filmmakers trying to influence people without actually being in front of them. That's something that's really interesting. And I found, especially going from more commercial work into documentary work, is once you put something out there, it's no longer yours. Like, you can have this very clear vision of how the audience will receive it, and then actually being in the room with an audience whenever they watch it, it's a lot of times it's really trippy, because it's like, man, they pick up on stuff that I didn't even see. Maybe they totally missed something that I was wanting them to see. And so that sort of play of, how do I have this concept that I craft and put into the world that delivers the right message, but also how do I balance that with what the audience takes away and kind of interprets in their own way? I find that really interesting. And this could be a question, is like, whenever you're trying to deliver something more informational, but also have that story element, like, I don't think I found that balance yet.
There's a group that I ran into at one of the first video conferences I went to. It was called the Harmon Brothers. Do you know the Squatty Potty ad that they did like 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago? I don't know what it was.
This is where your ice cream comes from. The creamy poop of a mystic unicorn.
If anyone hasn't checked it out, essentially there's just like this unicorn and there's someone dressed up as if, I don't know, I feel like it's like 17th century sort of dress. It's very different. And they're trying to sell a Squatty Potty to people that don't know that they need it. And they do it in a really interesting way. And I was at a conference listening to them talk about their methods. And it was one of those things like, how do we ensure that when we put this thing out there, that it will have the effect that we're looking for, like you're talking about? And they showed their process, which is they would write their script, ideate, put it together. They'd basically shoot a version of it a little bit lower production wise, just to kind of get the concept out there. And then they would bring people in and have them watch it. And they would make sure that they were pulling from whatever their target audience was, and diversifying that a little bit. And they'd have them watch. And they created what they called a laugh graph. So the idea was from 0 to 5, your belly laugh being a 5, 0 is like, I could not be more bored with this. And then they just did 5-second samples. So every 5 seconds was someone laughing or not. And they'd press play, have them watch. It was like a two-way mirror sort of thing. And they would just write, from 0 to 5 were people laughing. And they would aggregate all that data. Oh, look, we're seeing a consistent dip here. Like something's not working here. They'd go back, look at that, re-ideate, reshoot, re-bring people in. It was a very extensive process. But they shipped that when their laughs were continuously at the top of those belly laughs, that entire bit. And what was wild to me is we have procedures in our field that do the exact same thing with people, where what you're doing is you're trying to understand like what is influencing a particular behavior. You will chunk it in those 5-second bits. You will set up conditions in that environment, just like they did with playing the video, and you would take that data to understand what's going on there. You could deploy methods that'll help you figure out like, is this, probability wise going to hit with our audience? And so like when I work on small independent films courses, I actually try to bring a few people over to my house and have them watch through what I'm going for, and actually record them as they're watching it. I try to I don't tell them beforehand about like what I'm looking for. They know I'm recording, they know all this sort of stuff. And I'm looking for, when do they glance over? When do they look away? When do they look on their phone? And those are little indications for me on the video of like where I could potentially work a little bit more. So that's how I've looked at it, is we could basically, get some test audiences here. But it's pretty extensive process. Does that help, Charlie?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because you're right. I think a lot of filmmakers approach it from an art standpoint, which is fantastic if you're making a piece of art. But if you're trying to do more either science communication or education, or I would argue even journalism to a degree, it's like you really want to make sure that that messaging has follow through and people get what, the intended goal is out of that. And I think having that data driven approach is really, really interesting. I think a lot of filmmakers could take advantage of that, me included.
I don't know, maybe it's like a crutch of mine. Like I'm not good enough at the point to where I can drop that. Like I could see, the Christopher Nolans of the world not needing something like this, or maybe needing different aspects of it, or maybe it's like they get that influence through different ways. But it's been a useful process for me. And most of what I'm working on is kind of documentary style, or it's like speaking to, like you said, some sort of science communication where you're trying to make sure that it's not misinterpreted in some sort of way. So I found it really beneficial.
Okay, let's zoom out for a moment. We're also here to understand how we apply that in the context of climate change, and especially climate action. So let's hear what Ryan has to say about how human behavior ties into climate change.
I didn't mention this earlier, but behavior analysis really tries to always focus on an individual person, which is a little bit weird, but you can roll this up to society level, and I'll get there in a second. On an individual level, we're always trying to understand like what in the environment is influencing the behavior that I'm engaging in. Behavior will be anything a living organism does. So it doesn't matter if it's thinking, feeling, emoting, picking up, drinking some coffee, talking to a significant other, crying, listening to music. All of these things from our perspective is behavior. Some of them are a little bit easier to measure, like measuring your own thoughts is a little bit difficult. But measuring, somebody's overt behavior is a little bit easier. And so on an individual level, anybody that is trying to potentially understand, how can I be better when it comes to my impacts on the environment, could define whatever their goal may be, whether that's through consumption habits of what they're eating, consumption habits of how they're traveling, right? Those things could be set up. You could, with our methods, look at, where's my baseline consumption rate? And if your baseline consumption rate is not where you want it to be, figure out how, through changes in the environment, you can impact your consumption patterns. So everything is done on what's called a single subject analysis. They're not the most popular methods in science, mainly because there's not a lot of statistical analyses involved, and they're not trying to answer the question of how do we apply this at a group level. On the surface, though, it turns out that if you do a lot of single subject research, you do hundreds of these and verify them, you can get the same statistical certainties if you were doing larger group analyses at the start. I preface all that with an individual level is like what behavior analysis does extremely well. And a really good behavior analyst should be able to help somebody figure out where's your baseline at. If you're trying to increase it, how are we going to increase that? If you're trying to decrease it, how are we going to decrease those sort of things? Usually what happens in our science is we figured out, methods, whether maybe it's some visual prompts, right? Or maybe it's some environmental changes. So for example, like driving in gas-powered vehicles nowadays, a lot of the newer ones will, if you're stopped, shut off the engine temporarily, right? That shutting off the engine temporarily is something that was put in to try to preemptively prevent a certain amount of CO2 emitting in the air when it doesn't need to. These sort of like strategies can be deployed and see whether or not they affect that individual. Now, since we're all individual people, though, not all things affect us in similar ways. And so usually what happens is they're looking at what sort of prevalence does a certain procedure have on affecting people. Say it affects, only 60% of a group. Then when you scale that up, you're contributing to some sort of solution, but you still have to figure out that that other 40% of the population. And so a lot of what tends to happen is we'll figure out what's working on individual levels. Where does it fall apart? Like it no longer works for particular groups or situations. And then ideally, what happens is actually going into, at least in the States, the legislative state laws, federal laws, and trying to advocate that those scientific findings are implemented to where state laws, for example, will start to dictate what sort of changes happen on a day-to-day level. So it's always like individual data analysis, which can take literally like decades sometimes to really sort out and understand, then gets rolled up into, okay, now that we can trust this and we see where it works, where it doesn't work, let's scale it out to a population level. That's usually done at a state level or a regional level. From there, there's always this thin layer of politics and can you get it through the door, at least in America.
What about people that don't believe you? So you do this analysis, right? You figure out, oh, this is like objectively what would be best for people. And you run into that wall of a very loud minority, because that tends to happen a lot, especially around climate issues.
It's nice to know it's not just here. I think there's kind of two general approaches. There's a ton of behavioral literature that shows that the earlier that you can work at a population level of reaching somebody, generally the more open they're going to be to something. So for example, early education models, where if you could get in at like an elementary age of teaching critical thinking skills, and how to problem solve. Like I wouldn't even be talking about climate issues. I'd be like, here's your critical thinking tool set and your skill set so that you can reason through and come to logical conclusions that are rational at the end of the day. That has been something that has consistently shown that it works. I'm currently working on a small documentary and like course with a group in Seattle that focuses on these sort of things. And part of the method is you actually have to bring in a lot of different topics. So you can have them try to critique things, from a pro-climate versus a anti-climate stance. You could do this with pro, con, whatever it is that you want to bring in there. But it's teaching them how to dissect and pull things apart will typically lead people to being able to rationalize and kind of figure out what is the best solution at the end of the day. So a lot of it's like really early work. I I always feel like that's a little bit of a cop out of an answer sometimes, because what you're doing is you're just kind of shrugging your shoulders as somebody ages and is farther down the line and they're thinking there. But unfortunately, the data does show like the earlier your intervention on things, typically the better your outcomes are going to be there. That holds not only in critical thinking, reasoning skills, that can come outcomes in education, where how people move up the SES, social economic status in their lifetimes. It could lead to health outcomes. Like it's a robust, solid start with early intervention. The other side is your metaphors and examples that you use can have some really strong impacts. So this is how I've always looked at a solution for, you could use it in an early education kind of standpoint, but you could use it later on too, is people will play around with what metaphors tend to work for people with certain types of experience. So the metaphor that I'm going to use with somebody that is in a rural Nevada setting in the United States where I'm at is going to be different than one that I'm going to use in, say, Las Vegas, Nevada. The background, the experience, the where they're at, all of that can impact. Unfortunately, there's not like a robust bank where you can just go to and be like, okay, what metaphors seem to work better on certain topics, and all that's walked out. But over the last 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 now, our field's been trying to really figure out like what metaphors work, because they do fall apart across culture, across borders. Some of them will work in some places when you carry them over to another culture or population, but other places they completely fall apart. So I personally have a lot of fun with that. For example, we used to do some fundraising, and the fundraising was for people with intellectual disabilities. And a lot of conservative stances are that we shouldn't be donating to the situations where people are, quote, taking advantage of the system. That's a problem. But being able to help somebody get off of that system and become independent and obtain a job and be part of the workforce really resonated with them. So donations really came down to how did we speak to the donors based on their political beliefs or their political leanings to be able to raise that funding. Now, on the back end of that, you have to deliver on the outcomes. Like if I'm not getting people independent jobs, like they're going to see through that real quick. But you have to be also pretty careful in your wording there. So that's the two methods that really come to mind right now, Charlie.
I tend to test things based on sort of my perspective, because I think if I'm going to be showing a piece of work or trying to communicate something to an audience, like if I was in their shoes watching a piece of content for the first time, like what would kind of be my gut reaction? And one of those things is storytelling versus just talking about numbers and data. And I think that really touches on your use of metaphors. What have you seen in your work as far as the effectiveness of a story versus the effectiveness of just trying to explain literally something to someone?
All right, Charlie, story every time. And it pains me as a scientist to say this. It has been so abundantly clear. I don't understand the psychological reasons here. Like people tend to kind of lean on like, oh, evolutionarily, like we've always been telling stories and stories really resonate and like they transcend culture and like across generations. I just haven't spent time reading the literature to fully understand why single stories seem to do well. It's clear that they do. I'm very pragmatic. So it's kind of like what works, and I'm going to double down on what works because there's problems to solve here. So individual stories are definitely the way to go. That's what got me into really storytelling, and probably why I'm sitting here with you all is just realizing that if I want to influence something that is a societal level problem beyond that individual person, even though you can work with the individual person, if I want to do that, you need to be able to move people in ways that will impact things on a much broader scale. Climate change is a perfect example of this. No matter how many behavior analysts we would train up to go out, even if we set up funding streams to try to work on solving individual problems and people's consumption, how they interpret it, how they view it, et cetera, we will never be able to scale that treatment model, right? Like individual one-on-one working to ever do that. So for storytelling, for me, that was like this hack of if I can do this right, I could get people to adopt one little perspective change and potentially even influence how they behave day to day with respect to that problem that we're trying to talk about. Actually, I picked this up. I learned this from a mother of a child with autism that wrote a book a while ago. They were talking about how the data and the methods of science are sufficient, but they're not necessary to get people to kind of act. Like, you need to figure out the methods and the ways in which we're going to influence behavior. But at that point, all you need to be able to do is, as quickly as you can, figure out a way to get people to move and act on that using that science, but they don't need to understand the science and how it's working. They don't need to understand the scope, the scale of the problem, etc. As long as you can get them acting in line with what the scientific literature says, then you've achieved your goal. And storytelling seems to be one of the most impactful ways to do that. There's a few other things that seem to matter too. While I'm on that, the storyteller needs to be relatable to the person that you're trying to reach. That is a very big part of it as well. The methods need to be at least as incentivized or more incentivized than alternative options. So this is a big thing for climate. We're trying to fix the incentive systems, right? Like choosing green options over not green options. This has been a thing they've been trying to do for a couple decades, at least here in the United States. That's another aspect of it too. So is the person relatable? Is the science there? Is it working? Are there alternative methods that are going to be competing? And then can you package it in a way to where people listen really at the end of the day? So it can be different modalities, but storytelling is a big part of that.
One thing that you brought up that really resonated with me is the fact that the subject telling the story has to be relatable to the person listening to the story. And I wonder if that's a trust thing. And this is just purely like through my own observation of creating stuff and putting it out there and getting people's feedback, is that people are much more open to, or let me put it this way, they're much more vulnerable emotionally, and people tend to double down emotionally whenever there's like a contradiction on a worldview. They're much more open and vulnerable to change whenever there's a level of trust. To me, I feel like if the subject, or not necessarily the subject of the film, but the person presenting the subject is relatable, that person receiving it is much more open to be like, oh, okay, maybe they're onto something, versus going, oh, this person is ideologically different than me, I'm just going to ignore what they're saying. Just to kind of wrap that thought up, using stories in that method, at least for me, I think kind of what it does is it creates an image in my head, versus if somebody, even if it's the exact same person, is explaining data or charts or something like that, I'm not visually seeing that in my mind's eye. Even if I intellectually know what they're talking about or I agree with them, it's much more abstract.
Yeah, I think you're onto it there. The other aspect is like perspective taking around large numbers and stuff like that. Like, I think those things are learned skill sets. Like, you can show me data on prevalence rates and I can pretty quickly be like, oh, let's say that 1 in 50 people are experiencing this. Like, I can pretty easily quickly look at, in my local community with 500,000 people, like, oh my gosh, like this is, X amount of people that are struggling with this sort of problem. It just takes practice, I think, looking at those, and there's not a lot of places in society to kind of get that practice. So the data part will work for a group of people that are interested in data, but usually we're looking for ways to reach mass audience, and that's just kind of not the way to go, right?
I stumbled upon the term psychological distance quite a lot. Like, how far or how close is a particular topic? How do we feel related to that particular topic? If you can find a group or like a target audience that has a specific psychological distance to, for example, climate change, and you know what other topics are closer to that topic of climate change versus other topics that they find more necessary or are closer to them, it will shift in the way that the metaphors you're going to be using, and also shift in the way that you're going to present the topic to that group of people. I'm thinking of, okay, can we group people into similar traits, into similar interests, into similar experiences, maybe. An example here, the way that I communicate to scientists is not the same as to policymakers.
No, yeah, we would look at that as behavior analysts, just kind of like your learning history, which is this kind of dumping ground for all the things that you've experienced in your life. And then that psychological distance, right, is just looking at like how recent or how long in your lifetime relative to other things did you spend, experiencing that topic. Like I've spent some time going to different conferences around like YouTube's algorithm, for example, and I got to listen to their lead engineer a couple of years talk about. They have it was at the time I think 150 or so, a little over, behavioral indicators. And this is like what you click into, how fast you click into it, how long you watch for, whether or not you like, whether or not you comment, all these sort of things. What they're doing there is what you just described. They're looking at how do we take all this data and figure out what types of groups of people will find this sort of stuff really similar and interesting. So what you talked about as a method seems to be like wildly validated by YouTube alone. If you were to look at all the data and how their business model works and how they serve videos. Unfortunately, we don't have all the methods, right? Of like, how do we replicate that? I think logically what you talked about is definitely the way to approach it. And it's the way that I approach it too. I'm only going to reach so many people with a certain message in a certain way. If I could be hyper focused on that up front, then I'm going to really just stack the deck to where my science communication is going to reach the maximum number of people possible in that niche that I selected. And then, unfortunately, you got to be able to create a lot of content if you want to reach a lot of people.
That's the difference between the approach of Mr. Beast or like a niche creator on YouTube, for example. Now, you're talking about learning histories, and I know like learning histories for you is probably like the basis of of human behavior. But for the past half year, I've been really going down this rabbit hole called therapy. And I've been learning a lot about emotional maturity, emotional intelligence. You have people who internalize a lot more, so people who look within for figuring out the issues that are happening to them and like how to go from there. And you have all these other people, and I think this is a little bit more of that audience where Charlie was going towards, the people who externalize a lot. Everything that's happening to me is somebody else's fault. How does that tie in into the learning history of a person who is more adamant to do something about climate change versus when you have somebody who will probably not listen to what you're saying when you're just talking about, hey, we should change something or we should do something about the climate?
Yeah. I think what you're getting at here is really looking at like motivation, like what influences those groups to do things and act on things. A behavioral view of motivation, it is always attributed to the environments will motivate you. Now, real quick, the environment doesn't mean that it has to be like some poster or sign or some politician on your TV screen that's talking about something on your social media feed or whatever. It can be those internalized things too. Like my thoughts about, I want to make the world a bit of a better place. How can I do that in my local community? From our perspective, asking yourself that question, you're also listening to it as well. That listening is actually still an environmental component for us. It's this weird kind of philosophical line where your internal speaking is also your internal hearing. Like the same behavior does two things. And that's how we kind of at least grapple with the internal monologue. So when I say motivations in the environment or motivations around you, all it's saying is that somewhere there is something that is going to lead to you engaging in whatever that behavior is. So if I pick up and I drink a water bottle right now, it is both the fact that the water bottle is accessible, but it is also because there is some sort of thirst, right? Or stimulus going on with dry mouth or something like that that's going on. When you grouped people between like internalized versus externalized, it's sometimes just that the motivation is a little bit more clearly in like these physical environments out there, like the water bottle, versus for other people, it's a little bit more that it's, some of that inner monologue and stuff that's going on, or it's a little bit more subtle where like they're thinking about the stuff they just read on their social media feed, right? Or they're thinking about something that they had a conversation about last week at the bar with a friend, or, over dinner with a loved one, right? The motivation is still there. It's just gonna be harder to find sometimes. So to connect that to those two audiences, the tricky thing about learning histories is that every individual person's learning history is completely unique to them. Quite literally, we have whatever it is, 7 billion plus unique learning histories that are walking on the face of the earth. It's been whatever, 100 billion estimate or something like that. There's never going to be two people that repeat on that front. So I think the best that you can do here is look at what tends to move people from one area to another. So a lot of times they'll call this nudging. Like the idea is that you're going to nudge somebody through a really subtle form of whatever it is, piece of media that they consume is typically what it is. I think this has to be applied on a similar scale. Like the internalized people versus the externalized people that you just talked about are going to be two different types of people that need two different types of content. And they're going to fraction down even more, right? Like the person that's internalizing, climate change is impacting I'm going to talk about my local area. I'm near a ski hill and stuff like this. A lot of like really world-class skiing, like 45 minutes to an hour and a half away. Am I going to be able to ski in 5 years, 10 years? Or am I going to be able to ski teach my children to ski in, the next 5, 10, 15 years? Or we get a lot of fires, like a ton of fires out here as well. And that's experienced through, like, am I going to have health effects later on in life because of the amount of smoke that we inhale in the summer times and whatnot? Whether or not they're internalized or externalized, it's kind of like if you find the source that's most moving that person and most motivating that person, regardless if it's internalized or externalized, then you figure out what you need to make to kind of nudge them. And so I've been kind of like, it ties back into motivation. If you can find what their motivation is, regardless of internal, external, then you can influence and figure out that'll influence what to make that's going to most likely work.
Honestly, I'm enjoying listening right now because this is really, just from a filmmaking perspective, is really interesting to think about the concept of nudging in a storytelling manner. I feel like there's so many ways to sort of implement that idea into the way you construct a story arc.
What do you feel that filmmakers or storytellers could learn more from when it comes to behavioral analysis or like human behavior versus what behavioral analysts could learn from storytellers?
Behavior analyst to storytellers is an easy one. Most of our field is all about talking about statistics, talking about data and kind of data first approach and trying to convince people. And that's where I've consistently loved that line of like the data is necessary, but not sufficient to be able to kind of like move people along, hands down. The flip side of that is there are a few models. If somebody really wanted to roll their sleeves up, and this would be a significant amount of work, but there's a few models that people have that kind of conceptualize like what motivates people. How do you figure that out? And a really basic one, just to not leave anybody hanging here, is there are certain things in the environment that are antecedents that'll kind of trigger behaviors. So I gave the example earlier of seeing the water bottle triggers the behavior of picking it up and taking a drink. And then the consequences of that's not meant to be like a bad, negative connotation sort of term. It's just like what happens immediately after is a couple things. The taste, right? As well as the thirst kind of quenching are kind of a couple aspects of that. Something as simple as just looking at like what are the triggers and also what are the rewards or punishers that follow behavior. When you're playing around with like the musical score and the emotions of the scene, like you could pull it in that way too, of what were they just feeling? What am I trying to get them to feel when they're presented with this before I move on to the next step or the next scene and whatever I'm going for. But there's really intricate ones that people really want to roll their sleeves up there. So usually people kind of start with like thinking about these antecedents, consequences, and kind of like what influences people. And then there are some that you don't need to go to this level, but just so people know, there's some that have like 20 plus variables that you can kind of think of on an individual level that could help you think about how do I best prepare this form of media or science communication to impact this audience. There's a lot more methods that just aren't known about, I think. And it's like, if you dig around in the right places, I think it's going to help you be a bit of a better filmmaker, but it's like, it's going to be one additional tool set or tool in your toolbox. It's not the tool. It's just helps you look at the world a little bit differently.
I feel like that was the answer of somebody who is very data driven.
That could be a very fair way to say it. And I am very, very data driven. I like that little comedic break too.
So let me pull back here quickly, because if all of this sounds interesting and you're like, hey, I want to use some of this in my behavioral stuff in my own videos, we put down some of the resources in the show notes for you to access. And so far, we talked about the basics of human behavior and how understanding learning histories can give you some insights into how to approach people and how you can use those tools to connect with them. In the next part, we're going to dive deeper and we'll explore key behavioral aspects such as discounting curves, perspective taking, all fancy words that Ryan will explain in a bit. And trust me, it will make sense. But let's start at something you might have experienced yourself. Let's see what we can learn about climate anxiety.
Looking at anxiety first, because then it just applies to climate-related topics afterwards. A behavioral view of anxiety is going to look at, there's a couple like prongs to this. First is just like this ability that we have to engage in language is actually very uniquely human. There's a little bit of stuff that kind of seems to happen with a few other species. You look at dolphins as a popular example, but like you look around in society and what we've built and what we're destroying simultaneously, like that is in large part due to our belief that we're able to language, talk, reason, etc. Rather than just learning through direct experience, like contacting a situation. So I walk over, I touch the stove and the stove's hot and it hurts my hand. We could have the ability, not that we always do this, but we have the ability to learn through stories or language, right? Someone could say, hey, we're sticking with the stove topic, right? Like say when you're younger, you touch the stove and it kind of burnt you. And like, let's say later on, I don't know, let's say that there's some hot springs or like a bathtub or something like that that you're near. And someone says, oh, careful, if you touch that, it's really hot. It's just like that time when you touch the stove. Something like that can get you like immediately like, oh, like that hurts me. And you didn't have to directly contact that. I think we take this for granted because it happens so often, but that ability is very uniquely human. The amount of stuff that we learn in our lifetime through not directly contacting things, but through stories or examples like that happens like really fast. What's interesting there is that anything around anxiety disorders and experiencing anxiety tends to really happen through a lot of that indirect learning happening without us wanting it to occur. And so an example of this is like, if I were to ask you to think about a lemon, right? And really think about like biting into a lemon, the feeling when the lemon juice fills your mouth, like what starts to happen? Not for everyone, but for listeners and both of you, I literally, every time I talk about this, like my mouth starts to water a bit. Like that watering of your mouth is happening without you trying to make it happen yourself. Like it's just, it occurs, right? There's actually some really fascinating research that was done in the early 90s that showed that this happens and that this is like out of our control, which I think is a really unique thing when we're talking about anxiety. Just a quick sidestep on this. What they did is they taught people A is bigger than B is bigger than C. So the idea is just like these arbitrary letters. And you could be like, okay, A's at the highest level, B's in the middle, and C's at the lowest. And they would teach people, and they controlled for it a lot of different ways to be able to, like, it wasn't just letters, but like to simplify this, they taught people like there's these hierarchical relations, like something is bigger, something's medium, something's small. They, with like consent of all of this, it sounds a little crazy nowadays, I think. But what they did is for a certain number of the subjects, what they did is they took the B stimulus, showed it, provided a mild shock. That mild shock was just enough to create a little bit of that like anxiety response, right? What they found is when they showed the A stimulus, people would be more scared than the B stimulus experience. And then the C, since it was lower, would give them a less of a response. So just from experiencing the bad thing with B, they also experience now more bad stuff with A and less bad stuff with C. So I always give this example, like if someone thought about something that was like pretty heartbreaking or pretty devastating in their life. Like one time when I was younger, I was in a car accident that was really bad. Granted, everyone was okay at the moment. Very, very, very traumatic and like anxiety producing. If something else happened later on in my life, all it would take is for me to think to myself quickly, even if I don't realize it, oh, this is worse than that time I got in a car wreck. Now, without me wanting it to happen, the stress and anxiety that I experienced during that time, I just equated this new thing to be worse than that. My body will react as if it's worse. I can't control that. The way I look at anxiety here and the way behavior analysts look at anxiety is like, we're kind of stacked a deck that will help us in the immediate short term be able to usually avoid those situations. Like, I don't want to step into solving this problem because it's going to cause me more harm potentially to deal with this anxiety in the stressful situation. And historically, that's usually worked out pretty well for us evolutionarily. The people that avoid stuff like that tend to stick around for longer. I look at it as in a society to where most of those daily pressures, like not having shelter, food, having predators after you, those are pretty much gone. So we're still stuck with that anxiety likely thing to happen to us that we can't control, but there's new things that now come in and enter and induce that. So with climate specifically, like anybody could purposely or accidentally be like, oh man, this situation that's going on with the climate is worse than, or is going to be more impactful in negative ways than these other things I've experienced in life. And it can quite cripple somebody in the moment. It's this weird situation where, like, from our perspective, that's what's going to likely happen, is you're likely going to avoid situations. It's the easiest thing to do in the moment to immediately remove yourself from that. The solution to these sort of things is typically what we talked about with values and getting people to do a little bit of experiential work around what is it that you value and how can you do little things towards those despite the anxious response. And what that'll produce is if you get people to do just a little step, those little steps actually, the reward of those little steps they're taking will outweigh the anxiety response for most people. If not, you've gone too far on like how much you're interacting with it. So I know that was a lot there, but like that is why it's happening, is like we're uniquely engaged in language. That language happens faster than in ways that we literally cannot control. If you recognize the process, you can start to make some steps towards how do I rectify it through doing values-based work. So if we took an example of what you all are doing here, you could sit back and worry about what's going on with the world, or you can engage in behavior that leads to recording a podcast, putting a podcast out there. That podcast, while it's not solving climate change tomorrow, it is both, I think, simultaneously checking off your internal reward systems, right? Of we're doing something to make this a little bit better, but it's also allowing you to gain a little bit of momentum to things that are going to have a bigger impact later on. Like it's kind of like a double reward.
So on the one side, we're trying to fool ourselves that we're actually doing something, while on the same side, like if you're actually picking something that's useful, it can nudge towards some change that is worth doing.
Yeah. All forms of anxiety will always have some sort of a escape or avoidance. So like I try to get out of things that make me anxious, or I try to avoid things that make me anxious. And that's a predominant factor. So I think when people are really running into situations like that, like it is typically someone that does some good talk therapy or some good therapy. Like good therapy can really help you get over that. It is a difficult thing to get over on your own. Like there's some forums where they call it like bibliotherapy, like books that can help you kind of get over the hump. Like if it's debilitating, it's beyond bibliotherapy, right? But if someone's like, yeah, this stuff stresses me out and I want to do something about it, you're probably in a good spot to just, pick up some materials and get running with it.
I was watching the movie Don't Look Up.
Yeah.
Some people stood up because they couldn't finish the movie.
There's a 100% chance that we're all going to die.
Well, the handsome astronomer can come back anytime, but the yelling lady, not so much.
It's also because they have some more traumatic events that happened back in their earlier lives, like the fight or flight, or the freeze.
That's it. Like they're like what's going on in their internal monologue when they're watching that is they're relating in ways that you don't have experience from, since you have different learning history. And so that's why it might look like you might be like, oh, how did you not finish that? Like, why is that so impactful? Kind of pointed back, I was saying like the earlier you can kind of equip people with these sort of skills. Like if I could wave a wand, we'd do a lot of early education on like how language impacts your life, but also a lot of critical thinking skills. And it's not going to solve every problem, but it's going to allow people to kind of realize like, oh, in this moment, if I get up and walk away from this movie, it is also leading me to more likely moving away from these things in the future, because it's rewarding to get away from it now. And I'm more likely to do it again in the future. But it's also like, I now no longer am in a spot where I can talk with Tom or other friends about that movie. You know, like it actually impacts other things in the moment when you get away from that. Not only does it make the anxiety probably worse, but it's also going to impact your relationship with the people that sat through it, you know? So it can kind of spiral in multiple ways pretty quick.
Generational trauma, man. It does things to you.
Yeah. Charlie's like, I don't buy it. It's all bullshit.
I don't know what you people are talking about. I'm scared
I
of nothing.
I can handle that, by the way, too.
No, I it's interesting. So I had my first, if you want to call it that, like awareness of climate anxiety last year in the springtime in Texas. We have we call them mayflies. They come out in like swarms every spring, and it was a very dry year last year, and there weren't any mayflies whenever it was like around the season that they were supposed to start coming out. It was one of those things that it's like every year for my whole life, you kind of expect that, right? It's like, oh, it's the changing of the seasons. Oh, here are these stupid mayflies. It's just this routine that you get into every year. And this is the first year that I didn't notice them. And it was this really anxiety-inducing sort of underlying thing that I realized it was a loss of control for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like intellectually think about climate change and tell stories and going to the Amazon and on the ground. And it sort of becomes this almost abstract concept of here's the data and here's the reasons why certain, climate shifts are happening, so on and so forth. And then to just sort of have that moment to myself of like, wow, this is the first time in 30 years that I have not experienced this sort of normal, natural cycle. It made some headlines, some local headlines and stuff like that about how insect populations are down or whatever. But just to really experience that was very anxiety inducing.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of dismissed it at the time of like, that's like, once again, intellectually, I know these things are coming. So this is just one of the side effects of climate change. But to me, it was like a loss of control. It was like, oh, wow, this is coming. This is going to happen. And I almost wanted to just like give up climate like stuff and kind of what you're saying. I wanted to almost run from it and just be like, this isn't happening.
Yeah.
And it was a perspective shift for me of how much even small little things like that can really affect your behavior.
There's times that I've gone hiking in the Sierra Nevada range out here in like Nevada, California, where one year you're walking through and then 5 years later during a drought, you're just like, what's going on here? Dry years lead to more bugs of certain types, not always of all types. One in particular is like a type of beetle that gets into the trees. The trees don't have enough sap due to low water to be able to push the beetles out. Beetles kill the trees. So like I've got places where I've taken photos, come back 5 years later, take a similar photo, you compare them next to each other and it's like stressful. You can see, literally a third of the mountain's trees have died as a result of, and there's no reason any of them should really be dead, like at all. Like this is
Right.
this is purely because of low water levels. I've looked at it as those things in the moment definitely get me down. Like I can't do anything on a backpacking trip to solve that problem in the moment, but I can take opportunities like something like this that comes up and be like, yes, need to do it because it's in line with the values of like trying to solve this problem in some sort of way, right? Or through local voting initiatives or decisions that I make my day to day. Unfortunately, especially in the States, it takes a lot of cash and a lot of network to be able to like really affect things. So I try to also support in those sort of ways.
Me coming out of like that sort of initial anxiety last spring ended up being ultimately motivating for me. Because then I was like, let's put the gloves on. Let's go. It's here kind of a thing. But I can see how it affects people differently.
Are there any concepts that you know of that we haven't talked about yet here that might be beneficial for creators to think about when it comes to developing content, but also like to talk about climate change and direct it in a way that maybe isn't always climate anxiety inducing to the audience, but still gets the message across? Or is that even possible?
There's one topic that's really cool that's called behavioral economics, which is just kind of like a subset where some behavior analysts spend some time. I never got formal training in this area, but I read about it and I just try to understand like when do I need to think about these concepts and when are they potentially going to influence things. We've all probably heard at some point something kind of similar to this. They call it the marshmallow test. The idea is like if you have a kid sitting down in front of a marshmallow and you have them right there against the marshmallow and you're like, hey, you can have this marshmallow right now. But if you wait a minute, you can have 2 marshmallows, right? How many of those children are going to wait the 2 minutes for the 2 marshmallows versus going for the one right in front of them? We tend to, on average, go for the shorter rewards that are immediate rather than those longer term rewards that are really diminished and just kind of later on. The idea there is like your probability of reacting in the moment is very high, but it decreases and diminishes over time. That's why they call it a discounting curve, right? Now, everybody discounts things a little bit differently, like how long you're willing to wait for something will change across people. It can also change within your lifetime, like how long you're willing to wait in line for your favorite concert, and like get that front row seat when you're young versus when you're older might wildly change. But one thing that's been really unique is it seems to be that social media is a great example of a technology that people have been able to use at scale to not only understand somebody's discounting curve in the moment, but actually shift them. Can I get people to react more irrationally in the moment because of the way that I'm presenting material? I had a buddy do a thesis on this, his dissertation, and they were able to find through some simulations, it's just some basic games, their dissertation, that 99.9% of people that played the game, they could shift their discounting curve. And this was just through kind of simulating like a social media network. Why this is really interesting is there's actually a ton of power in these tech companies set up right now to where little changes can get people to no longer value something as much or more through the way that they make these sort of tweaks. So how prevalent like certain narratives are on a platform can shift how likely somebody is going to not only vote like later on in these sort of things, but also like how they react in the moment, whether or not they share, whether or not they comment, and those sort of things. So discounting curves and like what's going on in behavioral economics is really fascinating because in short, this idea of, we're not good at getting these longer, later, delayed reinforcers, which is what we're really trying to work towards with climate change, is the things you do now are not going to provide immediate rewards, but you're going to get these really significant rewards at the end, which is like your world is still available to you as it is today. We are not, as a society, set up to typically make that choice. Almost everybody makes a shorter term reward decision. And there's things that are maximize profits in the short term if the tools capitalize on the ability to get people to do those shorter rewards in the moment. There's a few people I know that are trying to do a lot of legislation work in the United States to basically not allow social media platforms to be able to push those people's discounting curves around, like not make them behave more irrationally. Will it happen? I don't know. I think money is much more, unfortunately, of a driver in American politics, at least right now, than science is. I hope we don't have to experience it, but like discounting curves and behavioral economics literature will show you when on particular topics people will be more irrational or more rational. Just now, the data is kind of coming out on like, can we move people along these? Some of that's that metaphor work that we talked about earlier. But the really interesting applications are going to be through really these machine learning AI sort of applications that's going on at the really large scales.
So from a behavioral standpoint, obviously risk reward, I feel like plays a lot into that. If you're looking at like the short term versus the long term, it's much easier for people to weigh risk and reward if it's like a here and now thing versus, what are we going to do in 30 years versus should I focus on getting food here and now? So it sounds like from an economic standpoint, we should be advocating for some sort of economic shifts that incentivize people to make better decisions from an environmental standpoint now, and those would compound over time. And that way you sort of offload this responsibility of people to think 30 years ahead by creating an environment and a system based on behavioral learning.
100%. This This is why you see EV credits, the tax credit system in the United States for buying an EV. Like that's exactly what they're trying to do there. Kind of population intervention level where people are trying to incentivize people to make the long-term decision over the short-term decision when it comes to like what type of car do I purchase. Yeah, you're spot on.
Like aside from the credits, like if you had a magic wand that you could wave to change whether it's a policy or an economic incentive, what would that be?
That's a good question.
Ryan for president.
Yeah, no, I don't want that. I'd fail and it would be so stressful. Although I'd get to know what happened at Area 51. I mean, if you could change something overnight, I think it would be trying to figure out how to kind of restructure government incentives for governmental employees. A perfect example is like you're not flying on your private jet over to the climate change summit. Like you're going to figure out a way to get there that shows you what it would be like if you weren't taking this extremely easy, quick solution, like experiencing the day-to-day situation or like the alternative solution that you should be doing so that you have that perspective. Because I think most of the people making decisions around these are just so far removed at the end of the day from what's actually going on that a lot of what we try to do on an individual level might feel good in the moment, but it's not going to be the systemic impact we need. And people with more power, more money at the end of the day in those positions can move things a lot quicker, I think. And because that's what we need. We need like the steering of the ship as opposed to like someone on the ship doing things correctly.
You keeping up here? I told you this is going to be a beefy episode. A great other tool we're going to dive into is this thing called perspective taking. And not to give away too much, that's Ryan's job, but in itself, it is something that might seem obvious. Yes, sometimes we need to see someone else's perspective to, well, understand what they go through. But Ryan also shows that you can use it in your communication to make your conversation partner stop, think, and do that mental exercise themselves, hopefully making a connection that they couldn't see before.
So perspective taking is actually one of my favorite areas to think about. The idea in a lot of areas of psychology is that it just kind of starts to shape and form naturally around the ages of like 3 to 5 in young children. Turns out over the last 20 years or so, we've really realized that no, it's just naturally that's when your environment, the people around you are kind of presenting situation in which you have to start to engage in it, and your language gets to the point where you can start to do it. And so a really rudimentary way that that's taught is you teach people the difference between I and you, right? Because I is me here, but I for you is my you. It's a little bit of a weird exercise to go through here, but like these terms are relative from your perspective, right? Here and there is the same. My here is your there is my here. And then now and then. So that's the one that kind of transcends time. So me 5 minutes ago or 5 years ago versus me now are different. So I and you, here and there, and now and then are your basic relations that help people learn how to take perspective. And reason I think this is important is you can actually embed these sort of things into your media, or you can use them as like a language skill, like a language tool where you are conversing with somebody back and forth. And you can use situations in which they have to put themselves in somebody else's shoes through I and you, or versus here versus some other perspective. I really enjoy doing this with loved ones when I'm talking about whether it's climate related things or just how the world's kind of changing politically or socially or whatnot. Having them realize that the things then and the things now, how they're usually not all that quite different, or they think it's different because of what they've been pushed. A good example of this is like a lot, not all, but a lot of our violent crime data in the States is actually trending downwards relative over the last three decades. But the amount of times it's being reported on is increasing. So the perception is that those things are increasing when the reality is they're actually not. So perspective taking, I think, is a really powerful tool. I've always looked at it as that I, you, here, there, now, then, and you can kind of play around with those as a science communicator and conversations. And the cool thing is those strategies are really the building blocks to how people teach initial perspective taking skills. So if you're playing around with those, like you are doing something that's kind of evidence based.
So one of the ways that I'm wanting to sort of start releasing content, I've been filming a bunch over the past 2 years, and I've been sitting on the footage. I haven't really released it all because I wanted to do that in the most effective way. And I think creating sort of like ongoing series on social media done through short clips is a way to sort of use all the content and use all the footage, but in a way that is a little bit more impactful versus releasing as just this giant documentary where I have to cut a lot out. One of the ways I've been trying to kind of figure out how to tie stuff together through that series was essentially what you were talking about with the I and you here and there concept, but I didn't have I didn't know how to put that into words. So whenever
Yeah.
you said that, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly
That's what I'm doing.
what I was trying to do. I just don't have the education to like,
Yeah.
so yeah, you described it perfectly.
Sometimes. So we know that people react differently to anxiety triggers because, well, we all have different learning histories. We also know that we can shift the way that we react to those environmental triggers by shifting our discounting curves. And by letting people take a perspective other than their own, we might connect some of our talking points to their way of thinking. Now, my question to Ryan is very simple. How do we put that into practice?
I think I got one thing I can point to. There's this cool table of in a research article. It's a list of what works for changing behavior or what doesn't work when changing behavior. And so when I'm thinking about this question, it's like, if people are going to have a call to action or they're trying to, influence a group of people to do something, you could reference this table and look at, am I stacking this call to action, stacking the deck in the way to where it's likely to work, or am I stacking the deck in a way to where it might not work? So for example, there's research dating back into the 50s that when you say present things as an us versus them mentality, it's going to separate groups further. So if your messaging is going to ever say, we don't want to be like those people, we want to, work on things that make the climate better, you're actually going to separate everybody that is in that them category further away from your messaging. You're also going to separate your people that do like your message further away from the people that your message is not reaching. I try to make sure, for example, like never put things in an us versus them mentality because it's not going to achieve my long-term goals. That was something I learned from there. There's some other things in here though. So they look at whether or not it's like language-based interventions or if it's like signage that you're putting out there, if it's technology-based things. And they just kind of summarize it pretty quick and they list you all the evidence that supports it. And the cool thing is you don't have to read the research article. You can just skim to the tables and you are going to understand exactly what's going on. They call them evidence-based kernels. So the idea is that what is the bare minimum amount of things that I need to do to get the behavior change? So the cool thing is they were like, hey, we're going to strip all the fluff out of all these procedures. What actually works? Let's communicate that. So it's at least a resource where people can go kind of look at real quick.
No, I just want to jump in with an anecdote is that I find that framing things in the form of collaboration tend to be far, far more effective as far as getting people on board or even getting people like to open their mind a little bit versus the us versus them or you versus somebody else. And I find just personally with me, it's like if somebody approaches me with the exact same like solution or issue or concept, but framed in a like, hey, this is sort of a way that you can get involved, or this is that collaborative nature of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
It gets me a little more fired up to be like, oh, this is something I can like get involved with versus, hey, this is a problem and you might be on the right side, but these guys are the enemies. I feel like that's almost overplayed. And I'm just like, it kind of turns me off a little bit to the idea.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that's not just my own viewpoint. That's an evidence-based thing.
For sure. And it transcends cultures, borders, etc. too. So one that's right below this, to give a positive example that kind of ties this together too, is you can use like graphic maps or like node maps. And the idea is just any graphic organizer that has goal-based behavior. And typically it's guided by someone that has status. So if you think about somebody that is trying to say like, here's how I successfully developed my company, or here's how I successfully changed my community. You can get more goal completion and more compliance, that is like follow through on doing things, by simply just providing the graphic organizer. So maybe your piece of media comes along with a kit that also includes some of these sort of things in your call to action. Just to reiterate, you don't have to read the article. I promise you, you can just read the tables, because it's a 39-page article and you don't have to read the 39 pages.
I just want to have one closing thought on that, which is, taking small changes, is that I think a lot of people don't realize the power they have on a local level. I'm a huge advocate of this, and you can go back and watch the first episode of this podcast to kind of hear more of what I'm doing there. But I've had a very eye-opening couple of years seeing the power of like advocating things to your local city council or your local mayor, or planning and zoning. Those are all public forums that are open. And if you have an idea for better bus routes or expanding a train network or something like that, that you personally would benefit from, but is also good climate wise or environmental wise, like going and talking in front of city council, like that can sometimes have a really huge effect, because a lot of times these elected officials just don't understand the problem. They're busy, they're politicians, they're not scientists, or a lot of times they don't even live in the area that you might be advocating for. So I think that could be a really good place to sort of start and explore whenever it comes to taking small steps that are within your control, but they can sometimes add to a larger sort of amplifying effect if you get in front of the right people.
I love that. A base assumption in our field is that we always say the learner is always right, meaning that like what they're doing in the environment currently is just a byproduct of the environment and how it's arranged. Like pointing a finger at a politician isn't going to solve the problem, and they're really just doing what the environment's arranged for. So like what you're saying there is you inserting yourself into that, being a part of their environment, will potentially alter the outcomes. It's always been a fun thing that I try to remind myself of. Like, if I'm upset about a situation, blaming somebody is going to get me nowhere. Figuring out how to insert something little that will have a potential for change is the best thing I can do in the moment. Coincidentally, you're not really getting into that us versus them downfall, hopefully, too.
I think it's safe to say that storytelling is still one of the best tools that we have at addressing climate change. So if you found this episode valuable, help us make this the biggest climate podcast out there by sending it to a friend who could just benefit from having these conversations. In our next episode, we will take a closer look at the climate movement and explore the role of climate activism, and debate whether or not, throwing soup at the Mona Lisa is a good idea or not. So subscribe now, and we will catch you later.